Her name was Grace Whitmore, 34 years old, the woman her husband's entire family had once called a freeloader, until the day they discovered her name in the final will of the wealthiest man in the Whitmore family. Grace found out she had been pushed out of the will, reading not through a phone call, not through any warning from her husband. She found out through a photo on social media. In the picture, Nathan was standing beside his mother, Margaret Whitmore, in front of a law office in downtown Portland. His younger sister, Claire, had her arm linked through their mother's, her lips curved into a victorious smile. The caption underneath was as cold as a knife. Father's legacy has finally returned to where it belongs. Grace stared at the photo for a very long time. Behind her, the kitchen still carried the scent of morning coffee. Sunlight fell across the wooden table that her husband's father, Arthur Whitmore, had once built with his own hands. Everything around her was quiet, but inside her chest, something had just cracked. She called Nathan. Once. Then again. On the fourth call, someone answered, but it was not her husband's voice. Margaret spoke very slowly, as if she were speaking to a child who did not understand manners. Grace, this is a family matter. A daughter-in-law does not need to be present on every page of Whitmore history. Grace did not answer right away. She could hear Nathan in the background, very close, very silent. For the past 8 years, Grace had learned how to recognize her husband's silence. When his mother criticized the dress Grace wore to her first Christmas with them. When Claire joked that Grace had married Nathan because she wanted to climb into a better life. When Margaret said in front of relatives that a woman without Whitmore blood should never confuse kindness with inheritance rights. Nathan had always stood there. Always heard it. Always chosen to look down into the glass of wine in his hand. But that day, his silence was no longer weakness. It was betrayal. Grace had once believed that if she was patient long enough, she would eventually be seen as family. She had entered the Whitmore family when their furniture company was in chaos, like a room after a storm. Tax bills had been forgotten, a bank loan was close to default, the books were tangled, long-time employees were not being paid on time. Arthur was already past 60 then, his heart growing weaker, but he still held on to the woodshop as if it were the final piece of his life. Grace had not been hired. She had not been paid. But every evening after her accounting job, she sat at the dining table, opened file after file, and stitched the numbers back together. She called the bank. She negotiated with suppliers. She found the losses that no one in the family wanted to face. Piece by piece, she saved the company, through sleepless nights and mornings when her eyes were red with exhaustion. Arthur saw all of it. He was not like Margaret. He did not ask Grace where she came from. He did not ask whether her parents had money. He only asked if she was tired, if she had eaten dinner, if she wanted to hear the story about the first table he built when he was 27 years old. To Grace, Arthur was the only person in that house who never forced her to prove she was worthy. During the last 9 months of his life, Grace was the one who took him to his appointments. She was the one who prepared his medicine in small boxes. She was the one who recorded every reading, every insurance bill, every instruction from the doctor. Nathan was busy expanding business connections. Claire was busy building a polished image online. Margaret was busy hosting tea gatherings, so everyone could still see her as the proud lady of the Whitmore house. And Grace was the one sitting beside Arthur's bed at midnight, listening to his labored breathing as he told her about a family history that his own children had begun to find tiresome. 3 weeks before he died, Arthur called Grace into his office. The room smelled of old wood and dust, with old blueprints stacked beside faded family photographs. He placed a thick envelope in her hands, carefully sealed. "Keep this somewhere Margaret cannot reach," he said. Grace frowned. Thinking he was speaking from exhaustion, Arthur tightened his grip around her hand. "One day, they will tell you that you are not family. When that day comes, open it." Grace did not ask anything more. Some moments make people fear the answer more than the secret itself. She took the envelope home, placed it inside her personal safe, and told herself it was only a thank you letter from an old man preparing to leave the world. 3 weeks later, Arthur passed away. The funeral was packed with people. Margaret wore elegant black and stood in the front row like a queen who had lost her throne. Nathan read the eulogy in a voice that broke at exactly the right moments. Claire cried in front of the relatives' cameras. Grace stood behind them, her hands ice cold, after days of calling the funeral home herself, ordering flowers, checking the guest list, and preparing every meal for the visitors who came to mourn. When Margaret thanked the family in her speech, she mentioned Nathan. She mentioned Claire. She mentioned the Whitmore bloodline. Grace's name never appeared. She had grown used to being overlooked. But being used to something did not mean it stopped hurting. 3 weeks after the funeral, the photo in front of the law office appeared, and only then did Grace understand that Arthur's words had not been the words of a weak old man. They had been a warning. She set down her phone. She went upstairs to the bedroom. She opened the safe. She took out the envelope that had been lying still in the dark for weeks. Outside the window, Portland began to rain. Inside the room, Grace tore through the first layer of the seal. And from that moment on, the Whitmore family no longer controlled the story they had tried to rewrite. The envelope did not open like an ordinary secret. It opened like a door that had been locked from the inside for far too long. Grace sat down on the edge of the bed and laid each sheet of paper across the white blanket. The first was a handwritten letter from Arthur. His handwriting leaned slightly, weaker than the old notes he used to leave in the workshop, but still painfully clear. He did not write much. He only said that if Grace was reading these lines, it meant his family had chosen to hide the truth. It meant they had done exactly what he had feared most. They had turned blood into an excuse to take what did not belong to them. Grace stopped when she reached that line, her fingers suddenly still. Beneath the letter was the most recent will. Arthur Whitmore's name was at the bottom of the page, beside the attorney's signature and the notarized seal. It was not a draft. It was not the vague wish of an old man lost in illness. This was a legal document, clear, clean, impossible to misunderstand. And Grace's name was in it. Not in the thank you section, not in a small line for a sentimental gift. Arthur had left her temporary control of Whitmore House and Timber, along with 40% of the company's shares, until the entire financial operation could be audited. If any family member attempted to conceal this will, Grace would become the independent executor. The room was so quiet that Grace could hear the rain tapping against the window glass. At the law office on the other side of the city, Margaret Whitmore was sitting in a dark brown leather chair, both hands resting on her handbag as if she were holding an entire empire in her lap. Nathan sat beside her, his shoulders stiff, his eyes lowered to the carpet. Claire stood near the window, scrolling through her phone, occasionally smiling at congratulatory messages from relatives. They thought everything was finished. The family attorney, Mr. Bennett, had just read the old will. According to it, Margaret was given control over most of the assets. Nathan received the executive position. Claire was allowed to represent the family in negotiations to sell the old Woodshop property if the family board agreed. Grace was not mentioned once. That was exactly what Margaret wanted: a tidy story, a noble widow, 2 biological children preserving the legacy, a daughter-in-law pushed to the edge like an extra chair after a dinner party. But Nathan did not feel relieved. He had seen the envelope Arthur gave to Grace. Not all of it, but enough to know that something was wrong. He remembered the afternoon his father called Grace into the office. He remembered the seriousness in Arthur's eyes. He remembered the way Margaret later asked what Arthur had said, and Grace only replied that he was a little tired. Nathan could have asked his wife. He could have told the truth. But when Margaret said Grace would make everything messy if she knew, he stayed silent. When Claire said an outsider had no place in inheritance matters, he stayed silent too. That silence had first looked like a way to avoid conflict, then it became a choice, then it became complicity. Grace's phone buzzed. A message from Claire appeared on the screen. "Do not embarrass yourself. My father pitied you. But pity is not inheritance." Grace looked at those words for a very long time. She was not angry. She was not trembling. There was only a cold feeling moving slowly through her, as if someone had opened every window in the middle of winter. She set the phone down, took the small USB drive from the envelope, and plugged it into her computer. A video file appeared. The file name had only 2 words: "For Grace." Grace clicked it open. Arthur appeared on the screen. He looked much thinner than the man people remembered. His shoulders sank beneath a gray sweater. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but his voice was still steady. "Grace, if you are watching this video, it means they did not invite you to the place where you had every right to be." Grace lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Arthur looked straight into the camera, as if he were looking through time to sit in front of her. "I know they will call you greedy. I know Margaret will say you do not carry Whitmore blood. I know Nathan may be too weak to defend you, but I also know something else. When this company was about to fall, you were the one who stayed. When I was sick, you were the one who stayed. When my own children could only see land, shares, and the money from selling the workshop, you were the only one who could still see the person behind the Whitmore name." Grace did not cry. The tears only gathered, heavy and hot, but they did not fall. Some truths do not make a person break down immediately. They make a person stand still, because at last, the pain has a witness. The video continued. "There are account statements in the document compartment. Give them to an independent attorney. Do not give them to Bennett. He knows what Margaret wants, but he does not know what I prepared." Grace paused the video. Beneath the envelope was another thinner stack of papers, business account statements, transfers made into Margaret's personal account, advances paid to Claire. A draft agreement to sell the old Woodshop property, signed by Claire with a real estate company, even though Arthur had never agreed to it. This was no longer the story of an abandoned daughter-in-law. This was an inheritance drama hidden beneath mourning clothes. Grace opened her contacts and found the name Evelyn Carter, the inheritance attorney she had once met during a business audit years earlier. Grace did not know if Evelyn still remembered her, but she knew she could not call Nathan, she could not call Bennett, she could not call anyone sitting in that room, pretending Arthur had left this world in peace. Evelyn answered on the third ring. Grace spoke very softly, but every word landed like a nail driven into wood. "I need to report a concealed will." On the other end of the line, Evelyn was silent for exactly one beat. Then her voice changed, no longer polite, no longer soft. She asked whether Grace had the original. Grace looked down at the papers on the bed. "Yes, and I think my husband's family just used the wrong will to divide the assets." Outside the window, the Portland rain fell harder, covering the city in a cold gray layer. But inside the room, Grace no longer felt small. For the first time in years, she understood why Arthur had chosen her. Not because she was pitiful, because she was the only one calm enough to hold the truth when his entire family was ready to bury it. The next morning, Grace arrived at Evelyn Carter's office 10 minutes before the appointment. She wore a cream-colored coat, her hair tied neatly behind her neck, her arms wrapped around a leather briefcase that held everything the Whitmore family had tried to bury beneath a dignified funeral. Evelyn was not the kind of attorney who used comforting words to make people feel better. She read every page with eyes as sharp as a thin blade. The will, Arthur's handwritten letter, the video, the account statements, the agreement to sell the workshop. The more she read, the colder her face became. At last, Evelyn took off her glasses. "This is not just a family dispute," she said. "If they knew the new will existed and still used the old one, this could be concealment of inheritance documents." Grace sat very straight. She had prepared herself for pain. She had not prepared herself for disgust. For years, she had thought Margaret only looked down on her because of where she came from. She had thought Claire was simply selfish because she had been spoiled. She had thought Nathan was merely weak because he was afraid of his mother. But now, the papers on the table showed her something else. They did not just see her as an outsider. They saw Arthur as the final obstacle standing between them and money. Evelyn sent the legal notice that same morning. Every transaction connected to Whitmore House and Timber had to be paused. Every business asset had to be preserved. The new will had to be independently verified. Grace's name appeared on the line for temporary executor, clear enough that no one could pretend not to see it. By the afternoon, Grace's phone began to ring. First, it was Nathan. She looked at his name on the screen, but she did not answer. Then it was Claire. Then, Margaret. Finally, a long message from Nathan appeared. "You should have talked to me before making things this big." Grace read that sentence twice, not because it hurt her, but because she wanted to be sure she had not misunderstood. The man who had sat in a law office without telling his wife was now blaming her for not warning him before she defended the truth. She did not reply. That evening, Nathan came home. He did not open the door with anger. He opened it with the exhaustion of a man who had just realized he had underestimated the woman who had always cleaned up every mess for him. Grace stood in the kitchen. On the table were 2 cups of tea. One was for her. The other was slowly going cold, not because she wanted to take care of him, but because old habits had not fully died yet. Nathan set his keys down. "Mom says you are trying to take over the company." Grace looked at him. "And what did you say?" Nathan swallowed. He did not answer right away. In that moment, Grace saw her entire marriage again. Not through the arguments, not through the anniversaries, but through the spaces of silence she had once convinced herself were peace. He spoke quietly. "I said everyone should calm down." Grace gave a very soft laugh. There was no joy in it. "Calm down is what you said when your mother insulted me. Calm down is what you said when Claire called me a gold digger. Calm down is what you said when your whole family read the will without me." Nathan stepped closer. "Grace, my father is dead. Everyone is confused." "No," Grace said. "Your father prepared everything very clearly. The confused ones are the people who thought that once he died, they could rewrite his wishes." That sentence hit Nathan harder than a shout. He turned his face away, but Grace still saw the shame pass through his eyes. It came late, too late. The legal meeting took place 3 days later. Margaret wore an elegant black dress with the old Whitmore pearl necklace around her throat. Claire sat beside her, lips pressed tight, her fingers tapping constantly against her phone. Nathan sat a little farther away, as if the distance between 2 chairs could make him innocent. When Grace walked in with Evelyn, the room fell silent at once. Margaret looked her up and down. "Do you really want to humiliate this family right after the funeral?" Grace placed the briefcase on the table. "No. I am here to stop this family from humiliating Arthur." Attorney Bennett turned pale when Evelyn presented the new will. He recognized the signature. He recognized the notarized seal. He recognized the problem before Margaret even had the chance to open her mouth. Then Arthur's video was played. His face appeared on the wall-mounted screen. There was no longer the sound of Claire tapping on her phone, no longer Margaret's proud breathing. There was only Arthur's voice, weak but clear. "Grace did not take anything from our family. She preserved what all of you were ready to sell." Claire shot to her feet. He was sick. He did not know what he was saying. Evelyn slid the medical records across the table. The doctor confirmed that Arthur was mentally sound when he signed. There were independent witnesses. There was video. There was notarization. Margaret looked at the file as if a venomous snake had just crawled onto her dining table. For the first time, Grace saw fear in her. Not fear of losing her husband, not fear of losing dignity, fear of losing control. Evelyn continued reading the terms. Grace would keep 40% of the shares. Grace had the right to block the sale of the Woodshop for 5 years. The business accounts would be audited. Claire would lose representative authority if there was evidence that she had signed an agreement before being authorized. Nathan could only participate in management if he cooperated transparently. Each sentence landed like a hammer striking the lid of the coffin they had built for their own plan. Nathan looked at Grace. There was no longer pity in his eyes for the forgotten wife. Only the late realization that she had never been powerless. She had simply chosen not to use her power. Margaret sprang to her feet. Arthur would never choose her over his own blood. Grace looked straight at her. He did not choose me instead of his family. He chose me to protect his family from the people who thought blood was a license to betray. No one could say anything more. And in that silence, Grace understood something deeper than victory. This was not a loud karma revenge story. It was not the kind of best revenge stories where people destroy one another with rage. This was the moment truth walked into the room, placed the papers on the table, and forced every liar to look directly at the signature of the man who was gone. After that meeting, the Whitmore family did not collapse with an explosion. It collapsed through unanswered calls, frozen accounts, and legal emails dropping into inboxes like stones of ice. Margaret still tried to carry herself like a woman who had never lost. She walked out of the attorney's office with her back straight, her chin lifted, the string of pearls resting on her neck like the final crown of an old dynasty. But her hand was trembling. Claire saw it, Nathan saw it, and Grace saw it more clearly than anyone. Real power does not need to be loud, it only needs one signature in the right place. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn Carter did exactly what Arthur had prepared. The sale of the old woodshop was blocked, the business accounts were audited, the agreement Claire had secretly signed with the real estate company was brought into the light. The investors were furious. They did not care whose daughter Claire was. They only cared that her signature had no legal value. Claire called Grace on a rainy afternoon. "You ruined me," she said, her voice breaking more from fear than from pain. Grace was standing inside the old woodshop, where the smell of pine wood and machine oil still clung to the walls after decades. She looked at the workers bent over their tasks, the same workers who had once feared losing their jobs because of a deal they had never even been told about. "No," Grace answered. "I only stopped you from selling something that never belonged to you." Claire began to cry. But those tears did not sound like regret. They sounded like the anger of someone whose hand had been slapped away from something she was about to steal. Margaret chose a different way. She called relatives, Arthur's old friends, and even people who had attended the funeral. She told them Grace had taken advantage of a sick man, that Grace was a greedy daughter-in-law, that this was a filthy hidden inheritance story created by an outsider. But this time, the story no longer belonged to Margaret. The audit report appeared. The money transferred into her personal account was clearly listed. The advances given to Claire were recorded line by line. The email between Nathan and Claire was found in Arthur's USB. The words "keep Grace out until papers are done" did not need any explanation. One short sentence, enough to kill every excuse. Nathan read that email again in his own living room, his face drained white. He did not remember what he had been thinking when he wrote it. Maybe he thought Grace would never know. Maybe he thought it was only a way to keep the peace. Maybe he thought his wife would forgive him again, like she always had. But that night, when he came home, Grace had placed her wedding ring on the table. Nathan froze in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. Grace looked at him. She was not angry. She was not crying. It was that calmness that frightened Nathan more than any rage could have. "I am ending what you abandoned a long time ago." Nathan stepped forward, his voice turning hoarse. "I was trapped between you and my family." Grace shook her head. "No, you were not trapped. You chose to stand with them, then hoped I would still be here to clean up what broke afterward." He said he was sorry. He said he loved her. He said his mother had pressured him. He said Claire had made everything worse. But when Grace asked him one simple question, he could not answer. "If that will had not existed, would you have told me the truth?" The silence stretched. And that was enough. A few months later, the divorce process began. Grace did not fight over the house. She did not need the keepsakes of a marriage that had rotted from the inside. She kept only what Arthur had given her. The woodshop was repaired. The long-time workers were paid in full. Part of the profit was placed into an employee fund, just as Arthur had wanted in the end. Margaret rarely appeared anymore. Claire became entangled in legal disputes with the investors. Nathan left the executive position and moved into a small apartment in the suburbs. None of them became poor in a tragic way, but they lost the thing they feared losing most. They lost control of the story. 1 year later, Grace stood inside the new showroom of Whitmore House in Timber. On the wall behind the reception counter hung a photograph of Arthur standing beside the first table he had ever built. The wood was old. The edge of the table was scratched, but it was still standing, just like Grace. She did not become the winner by destroying her husband's family. She simply stopped letting them destroy her. They called her an outsider, but that outsider became the only person who protected the family history they had tried to sell. They called her greedy, but they were the ones counting money before the dead man was even cold in his grave. This is not just a Reddit family drama story about inheritance. This is a family drama story about boundaries, loyalty, and the price of silence. If you have ever faced toxic family relationships, a toxic mother-in-law, or an inheritance drama that turned you into the villain, be honest in the comments. Was Grace right? Or was she too cold? Would you expose hidden family truths the way she did, or would you choose to walk away in silence? If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay for the next story.